Hello, class, and welcome to Lesson 7. This lesson, as you can see, is called Conducting Research. Purpose of this lesson, building off the previous one, is to give you step-by-step instructions for finding really good sources to use in your final paper. The last lesson, Lesson 6, served primarily to introduce you to the final paper so that you can start planning it right now, and that everything we can do in the course can contribute to that final product you turn in at the end of the course. This piece of that contribution is a very important piece, finding the research. So with the discussion board question you did last week, hopefully you have some idea of what you're planning to write on. You can change at any point. You can pivot. Don't worry about that. But because good writing takes good planning, it's important to, at this point at least, have an idea, an initial idea of what you're going to do. With the two things to have considered at this point being the real-world issue and the cultural artifact, the text you're going to analyze when you're proving your argument about that real-world issue. If you've got initial ideas for both of those things, then you'll be able to do some really good research in this lesson. So that's what I'm actually going to do, is I'm going to take you through the steps of the research process, how to find sources. And then for the discussion board after the lesson, all I'm asking you to do is to just do some searches, find some sources, and reflect on them. So like I said, if you do the lessons and the discussion board assignments, each one will contribute to that final product, and you'll be in really good shape. And this will be the research part. So there's really only two parts to this lesson, and they're not broken down into more parts than that, because all I'm going to do is real quickly go over the steps to finding great sources, and that'll just take a couple of minutes. And then for the rest of the lecture, I'm going to do an actual search using an example. And your readings for this week are the things I find in my example. So you can see how I go from the research to actually developing an idea, a more concrete idea for the paper. And so after I spend a couple minutes going over the steps, the rest of the lecture will be these visual aids that show you the actual search I do. And you can pause the lecture and follow the same steps using your research idea. And then you'll have a lot of work done for the discussion board and for the final paper. So what should the research process look like? First, state your topic as a question. A lot of you may ask, why start with a question? Well, if you don't start with a question, then you're already assuming a lot. And one of the main purposes of the research process is to learn more about your topic, so that when you get to writing your thesis, you have a more specific, concrete idea. If you go into the process assuming you know everything, then you won't learn as much. Your thesis won't be as strong. So start by stating your topic as a question. And in a few minutes, when we go through the example, I'll show you how to turn your topic into a question. Next, once you've asked that question and done some research on it, turn your question into a position. So this is where we start to move to the thesis. The idea is you use the question for the research process. You start to find sources, you start to read sources, and then as you learn more about the topic, you can start to develop a position on it. So state your topic as a question, and then turn your question into a position. Next, narrow your position. You want a really specific thesis. So I know there's a concern that if your thesis is too specific, you won't have enough to say for all the pages you have to write. And I understand that concern. But if you write on something very general, not specific, it will be really difficult to effectively prove your thesis. So what we're looking for is depth, really diving deep into a subject, not breadth, not covering a bunch of different things, but teaching your readers a great deal about a subject, because that's the most effective way to persuade them. If you have a very general topic, the reader's reaction will be, well, this person knows a lot about these few different things, but I don't really think they're an expert on what their main thing they're trying to argue. So you want to go in depth on your main thing. So you do some research, try to get some answers to your question. From that research, turn it into a position. This is the stance I want to take. Narrow your position so that you get closer and closer to a specific concrete thesis. Then finally, qualify your thesis. Throw a couple of words in there that make it so it's not a sweeping generalization. Avoid words or phrases like everyone or all of this, and qualify what specifically are you talking about. Once you've gone through those 4 steps, you have a really good thesis you can use in your final paper, and it all starts by researching the topic and using a question to guide your research process. So I'll show you in the rest of the lecture how I go from a question to a thesis that works for the final paper. Here's my question I'm going to ask for the example. What does the film Black Panther have to say about race? So why did I choose this example? As you know from the other lessons this quarter, I really like the Marvel films. And when Black Panther came out in theaters 4 years ago, it was this groundbreaking film. There had never been another Marvel movie like it. And I've always loved the character of Black Panther. So I really wanted to research and examine this film and understand more why it's so important and it's so relevant. Now, I've loved Black Panther for years. I was reading Black Panther comics 15 years ago, before there was ever a film in the works. So I have my own reasons for loving Black Panther. And I could have, hypothetically, before researching the film's reception, sat down and written probably a pretty interesting paper about it. But I would be completely uninformed about what other people thought about Black Panther. That's why we start with a question. So I know I'm interested in Black Panther, and I know that it's the first Marvel film with an African character as the hero. And so I know that race is probably one of the main reasons people are drawn to this film and find it interesting. It's also one of the most important topics, one of the most important social issues facing us today. So you've got the cultural artifact Black Panther, and you've got the real world issue, race relations. Now I can start researching, and I've got it posed as a question. Like, what does this film teach us or tell us about race? That's what I want to learn. And your question could be more specific than that. It could be very similar. Think about what you want to learn from the real world issue and from the cultural artifact that you've picked. All right, let's go through and see how do we research a question like this and try to answer it. So state your topic as a question, step 1. What does Black Panther have to say about race? The next step is to extrapolate key terms from the research question. So if I type, what does Black Panther have to say about race into a search engine, the results are going to be very varied. I'll either get millions and millions of results, or I'll get barely any results. And neither of those scenarios is good. You want a number of results that give you a good variety of information, but that are also manageable to look through. So what you need instead of a question are key terms. So I would put Black Panther, I would put Marvel, and I would put race. Now, look at the way I have this typed out. That's exactly the way you want to put your keywords into a search engine. The quotation marks are the first important thing to note there. If I typed my whole question, what does Black Panther have to say about race, into a search engine, I put quotes around it, it would only find results for that whole sentence, which means I'd probably get 0 or very few results. If I didn't put quotation marks around it, it would get billions of results because it would search for any piece of information, any article or website that has any of those words in it. So the quotations limit the search to the combination of words inside the quotation marks. So I put Black Panther in my actual search in quotes so that it finds articles with the words Black and Panther together. Because if it searched those individually, I would get tons of results. Then I put Marvel because Black Panther, there could be other uses of that term outside the Marvel universe. And then I put my topic, of course, race. So those are my key terms I'm going to use to search. What am I going to look for? There's different types of sources, which we really talked about in the last lesson. We talked about scholarly sources, so that's the first thing I can look for. And I can use the EW library to find scholarly sources, but you can also look for popular sources that are still credible. Again, I went into detail on the different kinds of sources last time. So remember, the primary source is Black Panther or the cultural artifact you're analyzing. The secondary sources are the ones you use for support and context, and those can be any combination of both scholarly and popular sources. You usually find scholarly sources using the library, and you find other popular sources on the web. So since you're going to be working with probably really recent texts like Black Panther that may not have a lot of scholarly articles written about them, after we go through the steps for the scholarly search, I'm going to show you the steps for the popular search. And here's how you find a source, a scholarly source. We'll do the scholarly source first using the EW library. And again, later in the lecture, I'll show you how to use the popular source. So EW's library has a lot of databases you can search through, dozens actually. So how do you know which database to use when searching? Well, they have these nifty things called library guides. And if you look at the required reading for this lesson on Canvas, you'll see there's one library guide for researching popular culture, which is what we're doing since we're using cultural artifacts in this paper. So you can use that library guide and you can use the databases on that guide, which is what I'm going to do now for my initial search for a scholarly article on Black. So here is what the library guide looks like. There's lots of good information on here, and you can get to it, in Canvas through the link I've provided in this lesson. But you'll see in that first, you can see I've highlighted this section that says Finding Articles. And you can see in that first red box, it says Databases for Finding Articles. So these are the best sources to look at for finding scholarly articles on pop culture. And the one I'm going to use for our example is the first one, EBSCOhost, also known as Academic Search Complete. So here you can see I've clicked on the link, and it's going to take me to Academic Search Complete. EBSCOhost is part of Academic Search Complete. And here's my search box. So I'm going to type Black Panther in quotes. Remember, so it's searching Black and Panther together. I could do it without quotes, and I could show you that, but it would get like a bajillion results. But let's see how many results it gets with Black and Panther in quotes. And so you can see I've highlighted here. Try to look at the PowerPoint. I know I don't have a laser pointer, but if you look at the part I've highlighted, 1,250 results. Now, you don't have to read every result, but you should skim, and we'll talk about how to search through results once we've narrowed our search. But does 1,250 seem like a reasonable amount even to skim? No, of course not. So let's refine our. Well, what I do first is I scroll through and I look, and I see if my topic is race, I see some songs that might, or one of them had song in the title. I see some sources that might work. I mean, a lot of them have Black or African in the title, but I don't really know, unless I investigate further, if those will really address my topic that I'm interested in closely or not, or just tangentially. And I don't want to spend time skimming these articles because there's 1,250 of them. So let's refine our search and see which of these articles comes up when we have more specific search terms. So this time I put Black Panther, Marvel, and race. And you can see I've really narrowed the results here from 1,250 to 188. That's still probably too many. I would say you want to shoot for around 25 to 50. they could do more to narrow, and I'll show you that. But first, we can start looking here and seeing which of these is most closely related to our topic by just looking through the titles, right? If you've got a fairly narrow search, like Black Panther plus Marvel plus race, and you get, say, like something like this, less than 200, you may want to try to narrow more, but you can at least start reading the titles and seeing, based on the titles, which ones seem like they're most relevant to your particular topic. So we're going to scroll through the titles now. And you can see a lot of these do have to do with race from the titles. So, Africana religion, Black Panther in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Black Panther and the problem with the Black radical. A lot of those might work. So those would be ones where I could click on them and learn more about them and maybe even skim them to try to decide if I want to use them in my paper. And you can see PDF full text. They won't all have that. But if they do, you can just, because of your EW library account, you can just click on that PDF and start skimming it. So here, I refined my search even more. And if you look at over here at the sidebar, you can see some things I did that narrowed it. I put the publication date as just 2018 because that was the year the film came out. Now that it's 2022, I could probably do 2018 to the present, but I'm primarily interested in the film, not the comic books. So that's one way to narrow my search. Now I've only got 21 results. That's very manageable. I can look through these. If I click on them, it'll take me to another page. If I click on the title, not the full text icon, the title, it'll take me to another page, which will give me more information. Sometimes they'll even have an abstract, which is like a one-paragraph summary of the article. So I can really look through these now and start to narrow and think about which one do I want to actually use in the paper. And if you have 21, you can narrow it to, just by looking at the titles and the abstracts, you can probably narrow to 10 or 12 that you want to skim. And then from there, you can narrow to maybe 5 or 6 you want to read or skim in more detail. And from there, you can narrow to the 3 or 4 you want to use for the paper. You only need 3 for the paper, and you can also use popular sources, but you want to have a few extras, because as you get further along in the process and you refine your topic and figure out more specifically what you specifically want to argue in your paper, then you're probably going to drop 1 or 2 or 3 of them. But this is a really manageable amount to be able to look through and decide what I want. So as I've scrolled down here, I've looked and I've tried to find which of these most closely relate to what I'm interested in about race. And there's one here, number 9. I remember you was conflicted. Reflections on Black Panther, the African-American/African divide, and scholarly positionings. Now, even though a lot of these have race or a term related to race in the title, that African-American/African divide there is really interesting to me in particular, because my particular topic, I want to learn more about race relations. How does this film speak to how different races of people relate to one another? So that one stands out from the others because it's looking at two, like a racial divide there, like 2 different specific ethnic groups. And that's more interesting to me for my particular research interest than, say, one that's dealing with just the representation of one race in the film. So this is, you have with your own topic, you have your own things you're interested in. So this is what you can do in your research process is, after you get a manageable number of results, like 25 to 50, you can scroll through and look, even just by title, which ones are most relevant to what you want to research. So now I can open it up, the full text, and I can start reading it, seeing what it has to say, and deciding if this is probably one I want to use in my paper, or at least carry with me to the next step of the research process. And I did really like this article. So my goal is to find 3 in this example search, because that's how many you need for your paper. And I'll show you, like I said later, how from reading these 3 articles, I eventually develop a thesis. So the research process leads to me, I'm starting out just, I know I want to write about something with Black Panther and race, but beyond that, I don't know what else. And so by doing research, I start to learn more. And so I start to read this article and I'm like, oh, African American and African are not the same thing. Black Panther, or T'Challa is his name, is from Africa, not the United States. But the antagonist in the movie, Eric Killmonger, he grew up in the United States, so he's African American. And there's actually a tension between these two ethnic groups in the film. That's really interesting, but I didn't realize all that before I started the research process. Now I'm starting to focus in on something that's really intriguing, but that I didn't know all that much about before I started studying the film. I just knew I wanted to study relations between different races. Now I have a more specific focus within that very broad topic of race relations. I have the specific focus of African American African. Now that I found this one article that I really like, I can start to look through and see if there are ones that maybe touch on a similar subject. One thing I could do is plug in another search term and narrow it, like maybe African American African. That might be too specific. I mean, I was already down to 20 results, so I could just skim back through the titles. And there's some that might work, like belonging, the struggle of two worlds and identity. That might work. I don't know exactly, but I could click on it, read the abstract, and see if it does relate to my now more specific focus in my research. And what I ended up finding, I guess you couldn't see on that last screenshot, was one called I Dream a World, Black Panther and the Remaking of Blackness. So this one seems useful, but you know what? They didn't have the PDF there. I couldn't just read the full text. So there's something called interlibrary loan. And you can see I've highlighted what it says there, request this article using interlibrary loan. Because of you're a student at EWU, you have an interlibrary loan account. So all you have to do is click that, fill out the form that pops up and submit it, and the library will actually get you a PDF of the article and send it to you. So you may not need to do this depending on what you're researching, but there may be a really good article you need that the library doesn't have, and you have to interlibrary loan it. This is a really important reason to start your research process early. That's why we're doing it in week 7, even though the final draft isn't due till week 10. All right, so that was how to find a scholarly source. Now we're going to use another one of those search engines called Google Scholar, and we're going to use it to find a popular source that's credible. So it may not be as academic as that last one, but still very credible. But Google Scholar's tricky. It's better than just using Google because it's Google Scholar, but you're still going to get a lot of information. So how do you filter through that information? That will be a point of emphasis for this second source. You can see again, I found Google Scholar from the link there on the research guide. And the reason Google Scholar is included on this research guide, it's not on most of our library research guides, but it's on this one because we're specifically researching popular culture. Black Panther, because of the way it speaks to race relations, is a text that, even though it's only 4 years old, already has a lot of scholarly articles written on it. You may be writing on something that is not as interesting or relevant to academics, but is still really important and relevant to people in general, and well worth studying in this class for those reasons. So you might need to go kind of beyond the library to something like Google Scholar to find more results, and I'm going to show you how to do that now. So in Google Scholar, I type in my same search terms, and you can see I get a lot of results, 1,460, and that's even after I've clicked since 2018 in the sidebar there. So you can't spend as much time on Google Scholar as the library databases because you'll just get lost. It's almost impossible to narrow your results the way that I did in the library database because it's Google, it's Scholar, but it's Google Scholar. You're just going to get tons and tons of results. So what you want to do is scroll through and look at the titles for a little while, and maybe you can find something. And you're definitely going to see things on there that wouldn't show up in the library. But you don't want to kind of get sucked in down the rabbit hole of just looking through Google Scholar because there'll be so many results. I was, though, by clicking since 2018, able to narrow it to 240. So it's not as great as the 21 I narrowed it to in the library when I clicked since 2018, but it's still a lot better. And you can see there's some really interesting titles here. And as I'm scrolling through, dialects of tradition and memory, that could be useful. So I clicked on it, I looked at it. But even though those things, tradition and memory, are kind of related to African American and African relations, they're topics unto themselves. They might work for another paper. But if you look down, you'll see there's one called The Ancestral Lands of Black Panther and Killmonger Unburied. Now that seems to line up really well with my other article because Black Panther is the African character and Killmonger is the African American character. And so that one, I'm betting, is a good chance that will line up well with my other articles. So let's definitely take a look at the PDF for that one. And some articles will have PDFs for free on Google Scholar, others won't. Others will for the EW library, but through Google Scholar. So be logged into your library account and be looking at Google Scholar in another tab. But let's take a look at this PDF. So if you look here, it's actually a scholarly article because it's the Journal of Religion and Film, and it's published by the University of Nebraska. So it's actually a scholarly article, but it didn't show up in the EW library. Our library is awesome, but it only has so many resources. So this is another good reason to use Google Scholar. So now I've got two scholarly articles that seem right on my topic of the African American / African divide. So this is really great, and this is a good use of Google Scholar, and I was able to find it on just the first page of Google Scholar by narrowing my results and being willing to spend a little bit of time on Google Scholar, but not too much time on there. So we've got two scholarly sources now, one through the library, one through Google Scholar, but we can definitely include popular sources. And even though for Black Panther, I could probably find all scholarly sources, a lot of your text you won't be able to. So I want to demonstrate that. And moreover, in particular with Black Panther, I am interested in this popular reception of it, and got a very specific topic. So maybe I want to look beyond the scholarly sources and see what the popular sources have to say about this really specific topic. We're living in a day and age where actually popular sources are in many circles regarded as just as important and just as worthwhile as scholarly sources, and more people are starting to use them. Now, they still need to be credible, and less than 8 will be devoted to discerning the credibility of a source. But now I'm going to show you how to find popular sources, because that's even more tricky than using Google Scholar. So what do you search for with popular sources? Well, you kind of have to know where to look. And so I've tried to give you some examples of places you can look in this class just in the readings I've assigned. So we've read readings from newspapers like The Atlantic. The piece we read last time on Halloween was from an online journal called Vulture. And there's a lot of online journals called like Vulture and Vox and other similar ones that publish really good, well-written, credible, popular articles on popular culture. They're not scholarly, but they're very credible. And so I'm actually, because I know Vulture as a publication has good articles on pop culture, I'm actually just going to search for Black Panther, race, and Vulture. And Vox is another journal like Vulture, so I'm going to search that one next. If you're writing on a film or a show, maybe even a video game, Vulture or Vox would be good places to look. If you're writing on something that's maybe not as mainstream as a film or a show, there's other web journals you can look at. If you have any trouble finding sources, reach out to me or to the library, and I can help you, or any of the great staff at the library can help you too. But let's see what I get here. I get some stuff that's totally not related, like RuPaul's Drag Race, because I put the word race in there. But I do get a lot of Black Panther things. And look, you'll see, even though the first 6 or so articles that came up are from Vulture, because Vox is a similar journal. Even though I put Vulture in the search engine, an article from Vox actually came up because they're that similar in the way Google as a search engine works. It's so broad. So in this case, the broadness of Google actually helped me. But you see on the same search that it's also detrimental because Drag Race is not remotely related to my topic. So you see both the benefit and the drawback of Google there, how the library databases are more specific, but also more limited. Google is more broad, but there's also perhaps more unrelated material to have to kind of sift through. So, but this one, Black Panther, a groundbreaking celebration of Black culture from Vox, that seems like a great choice for my topic. Let's take a look at that. And sure enough, here it is. And, I've read through this article now. Excuse me. It's great. It really talks about how important this film is for Black culture. And I think that is going to speak to the other two pieces I have really well. So with now 3 different viewpoints, 3 articles, I'm really starting to get a multifaceted look at the specific issue of African American and African race relations. We've got 3 articles now, but what are some other tips for when you're searching for articles? If you're having trouble finding sources, instead of searching by title, search by genre. So let's say I really wanted to write, instead of on Black Panther, let's say I really wanted to write on Eternals, the Marvel movie that just came out to Disney Plus in the last few weeks. Well, there might not be a whole lot of articles on that one yet, but there's a lot of articles on the Marvel Universe. So what issues from Eternals am I interested in? I could search for that real-world issue in the Marvel Universe, and I might get some hits. And now remember, you can use sources on the real-world issue, sources on the cultural artifact, or a combination of both. So if you're really having trouble finding articles on the cultural artifact, there'll almost inevitably always be articles on the real-world issue. But again, if you're having any trouble, email me. So I could just do Marvel film plus race. Like, let's say I really wanted to write about race in the Marvel Universe in 2017, a year before Black Panther came out. I wouldn't have found many articles, but there are African American characters. Like maybe I really want to study Falcon from the Captain America films. Well, there probably, if I searched Falcon or Captain America plus race, I probably wouldn't get much. But if I searched Marvel film plus race, I would get whatever was out there on Marvel films in the topic of race, and I'd probably be able to develop enough research to still make an argument about the Falcon and the Captain America films pre-Black Panther, even if I didn't find articles that directly talked about that. So again, you can search like within the genre, even if you can't find things on your specific cultural artifact. And that's basically what I just said. To kind of sum up, articles on how your type of text being the genre. So maybe you're looking at the horror genre, but they don't have articles on your specific film, or science fiction or mystery, but you can't find ones on your specific film. Then you can find ones on the genre and how they relate to the real world issue. And you can actually search the library databases for popular sources, not just scholarly ones. So some of the library databases on that research guide, if you click on some of the other ones, have newspaper articles and film reviews and other things like that in them. Again, if it's a source you deem credible, which we'll talk about in the next lesson, and you find it, however you find it is great. As long as it's credible, I don't really care how you find it. You can find it from the library or other means. Okay. Now, one thing I've mentioned all throughout this lesson is that you can use your research to develop a thesis. And you're like, well, I've never done that before. It might be what you're thinking. How do I do that? So let's take a look at these 3 articles I found for my topic. And what you want to do is analyze and then synthesize. What we've talked about so far is really just the first step of the research process, using a question to find search results. And we've talked about how to narrow and find good search results. Let's say hypothetically, you're this far along in your own process and you really found 3 really good sources. They all seem very relevant to your specific topic. If you've narrowed to 3 or 4 or 5, you really want to read and study, or skim in depth, but basically critically read, like going back to lesson 2, critically read those articles and say, what does this article 1, article 2, article 3, what does each one have to say about my topic? And analyze them, and synthesize means combine or connect. So what do they all have in common? What are they all saying? What points do they disagree on? Because once you've outlined that conversation, you can answer the question, what do I want to say about this topic? Because you want to put good research in your paper, but you don't want to just repeat what other sources have said, because then there's no reason to write your paper. This is your paper, your unique argument. So read the sources, read them closely, figure out what they're saying, figure out what they haven't said, figure out what you want to say that they haven't said, and then put your voice into that conversation. So start your topic as a question. We've done that to find good sources. Turn your question into a position. That's what we're going to do now. Narrow your position. We'll get to that too. Qualify your thesis. Let's synthesize these sources to go through those other steps. So I've got source 1. If I want to sum up its argument in about one sentence, I would say explains the differences and tension between African and African American cultures. So obviously African cultures are cultures from the continent of Africa, and African American cultures are cultures in the U.S., people of African descent who've grown up in the U.S. They're not the same thing. And Black Panther, the film, really makes that clear. This article helps kind of explain those differences and really outline the differences between the two groups. Article 2, which I found using popular means, but really is a scholarly article, goes more specific. It goes into T'Challa as representing Africa, Killmonger representing African American cultures, and it focuses specifically on the concept of privilege, and that there's a connection between Killmonger and growing up in poverty in the U.S. and not having the same kinds of resources that T'Challa has in Africa. Now, this movie is just one example, and there's all kinds of poverty throughout different places in Africa, but the specific fictional culture from which Black Panther comes from in the film and comic books is a very privileged culture. So what this article is really doing is looking at 2 different racial groups of the same descent, but who grew up in different areas, and one had privilege and one did not. So it's not necessarily just about African and African American, because T'Challa is a representative of one specific fictional African culture. So what it's really looking at is the connection between race and privilege. The third article is pretty much, the title sums it up, is it's a gorgeous, groundbreaking celebration of Black culture. So even though there may be some tensions or some issues between the different cultures in it, ultimately it celebrates Black culture, using the word Black there to encompass both African and African American people. In a way, it celebrates all of Black culture in that sense, in a way that no Marvel film, or really probably any film of that superhero, maybe even action genre, has ever done before. So these are the 3 arguments on their own. What are the connections between them? Synthesis are the connections between them. So when I synthesize these articles, I see that all 3 articles discuss the positive portrayals of race in the film and touch on the class distinctions between the main characters, but do not fully examine these distinctions in class. So what do they have in common? They all say this is a great portrayal of race that is different than pretty much all other portrayals of race in the past in the superhero genre. That's why this film was so groundbreaking and popular. Awesome. 2 of them touch on how within that celebration of race, there are class distinctions embodied by the two main characters, protagonist and antagonist. But even in the article that has African and African American in the title, they don't really explore these tensions deeply enough. There's great stuff in the articles, but more could still be said. So I've looked at each article on its own. Through all three of them, I've learned a great deal about a topic that I knew some about, but I did not know nearly as much as I know now when I started. And I've seen what they've learned, what they've taught me, what I've learned, but also where there's still more work to be done, where I can really enter in and build on top of what others have already said. So now I can turn my question into a position. What does the film Black Panther have to say about race? While Black Panther provides a glorious celebration of Black culture, it fails to fully explore the class tensions it presents and ultimately resorts to portraying stereotypes of class differences when the hero comes from a background of privilege and the villain a background of poverty. So this is a hypothetical example, but could actually be a really good thesis for the paper that you have to write in this class. So by saying, while Black Panther provides a glorious celebration of Black culture, comma, what I'm doing there is saying I've done the research, I've learned what the research has to say about the film. So I'm educated on the topic. I'm not that uneducated person who just wrote a thesis without doing any research. That's what that first sentence says. The next sentence it says, or the next clause within that sentence says, it fails to fully explore the class tensions it presents. That's what the other two articles, the first two, said. So I'm not really saying anything new there, but I've touched on two of the key things other people have said about Black Panther. And so you have a celebration of Black culture, but you have a tension between classes. And I'm saying it doesn't fully, the film, even though it presents that tension, it doesn't fully explore it. It doesn't really address it. It's just kind of there. Now I add my own idea to the conversation. So this is really my thesis. The rest was like background on the research, and ultimately resorts to portraying stereotypes of class differences. So even though it's this groundbreaking representation of Black cultures in general, you have the hero comes from privilege and the villain comes from poverty. That's kind of cliche. That's kind of stereotypical, that the poor guy is the bad guy. The rich guy has all the means and resources. So that's my thesis about the film. And I've shown how there's no way I could have written this thesis before I did research. So that's why it's good I started as a question. But how by doing really good research and really narrowing to some great articles and then reading those articles, synthesizing their arguments, but then figuring out what is missing, what can I add, I've come up with a thesis that's very unique. And by incorporating my research into the paper, I can show readers how that thesis is unique. So hopefully that's helpful to you. You don't have to have your thesis yet, but for the discussion board, please try some searches and try to find some sources and get started on this process. And next week, in lesson 8, we'll look at discerning credible sources, so you can really find good sources if you want to use some popular ones. In week 9, you'll do your rough draft, so then you can actually get to your thesis. But here's an example of how to find research, study what's already been said, and develop your own unique thesis.